The desert air was heavy with dust and death. Under a merciless sun, 800 men stood in silence, their shields gleaming like cold steel mirrors, their eyes fixed on the horizon where a black tide of warriors approached. 40,000 enemies, cavalry, archers, infantry, an unstoppable force that had crushed every foe before it. By every law of war, the outcome was certain. These men from the north would die here. They knew it. Their enemies knew it. The world itself seemed to know it. But these weren't ordinary soldiers. They were Vikings, warriors forged in 1,000 battles, bound not just by blood but by something far more dangerous, faith. They had not come to the Holy Land seeking glory or conquest. They had come to die, and in dying, to become legends. What happened next would defy every rule of medieval warfare. Strategies that should have ensured annihilation shattered like glass. Superiority in numbers turned into chaos. And an army that believed itself invincible would break and run before men who fought as if they were already dead. This is the forgotten story of Magnus Barefoot and his 800 fanatics, a tale of unimaginable courage, terrifying fanaticism, and the brutal power of belief. It's a story that changed the course of the Crusades, terrified empires, and proved that sometimes the deadliest weapon on the battlefield isn't a sword or a firestorm, but the human will. And it all began on that scorching day in 1064, when 800 Vikings marched into certain death and rewrote the meaning of war forever. The desert has a way of swallowing men whole. It's an ancient, merciless force, stripping the weak, testing the strong, and immortalizing only those who dare to challenge the impossible. And in the spring of 1064, that is exactly what 800 men from the far-flung, frozen lands of the north set out to do. Their story begins not under the scorching Middle Eastern sun, but far away, among the mist-covered fjords and snow-capped mountains of Norway, a land of cold winds and colder steel. For centuries, the Vikings had carved their legend across Europe with axe and fire. They raided, conquered, and terrified kingdoms from the British Isles to the gates of Byzantium. But by the 11th century, something profound had changed. Christianity had taken root in Scandinavia, not erasing the old Viking spirit but fusing with it. The result was something new, something infinitely more dangerous, warriors who fought not just for gold and glory, but for God. At the heart of this transformation stood Magnus III of Norway, known to history as Magnus Barefoot, a warrior king with the soul of a conqueror and the vision of a prophet. His nickname came from his habit of wearing traditional Gaelic garments into battle, a symbol of his disregard for convention and his appetite for risk. Magnus was no ordinary king content to rule a quiet realm. He was a man who believed destiny was forged on the battlefield, and in the mid-11th century, destiny was calling from the east. It came in the form of a message from Pope Alexander II, a fiery call to arms urging Christians to defend the sacred places of their faith in the Holy Land. For most European nobles, this was an opportunity for power and influence, a chance to win titles, land, and papal favor. But Magnus saw something different. Where others saw politics, he saw prophecy. Where others saw an expedition, he saw a crusade of the spirit, a chance to combine the ferocity of the Viking warrior with the righteousness of divine mission. In Magnus' eyes, the war for Jerusalem was not just another campaign. It was the ultimate test, a chance to prove that faith itself could become a weapon more powerful than any sword. And so he began to prepare an expedition unlike anything the world had ever seen. The recruitment process was brutal. Magnus didn't want ordinary soldiers. He wanted legends. From across the Nordic lands, he summoned only the most battle-hardened warriors, men who had fought in endless wars between rival kingdoms, who had spilled blood on foreign shores, who had looked death in the eyes and never blinked. Of the thousands who answered the call, only 800 were chosen. Each man had to prove himself in 3 ways. First, he had to demonstrate unmatched skill with axe and sword, not just raw strength, but mastery. Second, he had to possess inhuman endurance, capable of marching for days without rest and fighting even when his body screamed for mercy. And finally, most importantly, he had to possess an unshakable faith in the mission. Magnus was not leading a mere warband, he was assembling an army of zealots. For months, these chosen few trained with a discipline that would have been unthinkable for earlier generations of Vikings. Traditionally, Viking warfare had been about individual prowess and chaotic aggression. But Magnus understood that against the great armies of the East, brute strength alone would not be enough. And so he transformed his warriors. They learned to fight as a single, unified organism, to hold tight defensive formations, to execute coordinated strikes, and to maintain their discipline even under overwhelming pressure. But their transformation was not merely physical. Magnus also brought in priests, monks, and warrior chaplains to forge the spiritual side of his army. Every morning began with prayer. Every night ended with blessings. Every weapon was consecrated. The men came to believe they were not just soldiers, they were instruments of God's will. To die in battle was not defeat, it was a direct path to paradise. As spring approached, Magnus' fleet gathered in the fjords near Bergen, a ghostly procession of longships carved with dragon-headed prows, their sails painted with holy symbols. Yet even now, Magnus was not ready to set sail for Jerusalem. He knew that experience was as crucial as faith, and so the expedition's journey would become a pilgrimage of blood. Their first stop was the Orkney Islands, where Magnus recruited local warriors hardened by years of fighting in warmer climates. From there, the fleet swept south, striking along the coasts of Spain. In these early clashes with Muslim forces, the Vikings quickly learned that the enemy they now faced was unlike any they had fought before. These were not the Saxons or Danes of home, these were Saracen warriors, expert horsemen, deadly archers, masters of battlefield maneuver. And yet, the Vikings discovered something crucial. While the Saracens were skilled, they were utterly unprepared for the kind of desperate, fanatical ferocity that came from men who believed death was their destiny. It was a lesson that would soon shatter armies. By winter, Magnus' fleet reached the magnificent city of Constantinople, heart of the Byzantine Empire. Here, alliances were forged, weapons upgraded, and the Vikings learned the secrets of exotic war technologies, including a fearsome incendiary substance known as Greek fire, a liquid that clung to flesh and armor and could not be extinguished by water. Armed with new knowledge and new tools, the warriors of the North were now more dangerous than ever. By the time spring returned, word of this strange northern army had already spread across the Muslim world. And yet, the rulers of the region were unimpressed. What were 800 men compared to the vast armies that guarded the Holy Land? In Jerusalem, the great commander Emir Abu Nasr Shams al-Muluk saw their arrival not as a threat but as an opportunity, a chance to crush a Christian force so completely that it would discourage future crusaders from ever setting foot in his domain. He gathered a host of 40,000 men, elite cavalry, deadly mounted archers, heavily armored infantry, even siege engines. Against this tidal wave of steel and flesh, the 800 Vikings would be nothing but a drop of blood in the sand. And so the stage was set. On the arid plains southeast of Jerusalem, near the ancient fortress of Herodion, the two forces finally faced one another. On one side stretched an ocean of soldiers, banners snapping in the hot wind, the earth trembling under the thunder of hooves and marching feet. On the other stood a single, compact formation of 800 men, silent, motionless, their shields gleaming beneath the punishing sun. The contrast was almost comical. It looked less like a battle and more like an execution waiting to happen. Abu Nasr's plan was simple, a strategy he had used many times before. His cavalry would encircle the Vikings completely. His archers would rain down arrows to weaken them. Then his infantry would march in and crush whatever remained. It was a textbook tactic, one that had never failed him. But Magnus had anticipated every move. For months, he and his commanders had studied the tactics of the Saracen armies, analyzing their strengths and searching for their weaknesses. And they had crafted a plan, one that did not rely on survival. These men had no intention of living through the day. They planned to die, but to die as martyrs, and to take as many enemies with them as possible. At dawn, the desert air trembled with the sound of Saracen war horns. Thousands of cavalry surged forward, their scimitars flashing in the morning light. It should have been the beginning of the end. Instead, it was the beginning of something the world had never seen before. The Vikings did not hold their ground as expected. They did something utterly unthinkable. They split apart. It was a maneuver born of months of grueling training and psychological warfare. The Vikings understood something most armies of the era did not: fear is more powerful than numbers. And on that battlefield, fear was about to become their greatest weapon. This was not just another clash of armies. It was a collision of ideologies, of two completely different visions of war. One side believed in overwhelming force and crushing the enemy under sheer weight and numbers. The other believed in destiny and a divine purpose that made death meaningless and victory inevitable. And as the sun climbed higher over the sands of Jerusalem, that second belief was about to rewrite the rules of medieval warfare forever. The morning of the battle dawned red, not with blood, not yet, but with a sky streaked in crimson light, as if the heavens themselves were warning of the slaughter to come. On the dusty plain southeast of Jerusalem, near the ancient fortress of Herodion, two worlds stared each other down. One was an empire, vast, confident, and unshakable. The other was a handful of men, exhausted, outnumbered, and yet utterly unafraid. The Saracen army stretched across the horizon like an iron sea. 40,000 soldiers, cavalry in glistening armor, archers poised with drawn bows, lines of infantry armed with spears and shields. War drums thundered. Banners snapped in the desert wind. The ground trembled beneath the hooves of thousands of horses. It was a sight designed to break the enemy before the first arrow ever flew. The Vikings did not break. 800 men stood shoulder to shoulder in a tight square formation, their round shields locked, their axes and swords glinting under the rising sun. They were silent, no shouting, no taunts, no prayers spoken aloud. Their silence was more terrifying than any war cry, for it spoke of something deeper than courage. It spoke of resignation, not to defeat, but to death itself. Abu Nasr, commanding from a high vantage point, watched the tiny formation with disdain. This would be over by noon, he thought. His plan was simple and had never failed him before. First, the cavalry would surround the enemy on all sides. Then the archers would rain death from above. Finally, the infantry would close in and crush whatever was left. Against thousands, what could a mere 800 possibly do? But Magnus Barefoot had been studying this enemy for months, and he had no intention of playing by their rules. At the sound of a single horn, the Viking formation shifted. It didn't crumble or retreat, it divided. The square broke apart into 8 smaller units of 100 men each, forming concentric defensive circles spaced evenly across the desert floor. To Abu Nasr, this looked like chaos, a desperate, foolish maneuver from men who had already accepted their fate. But to Magnus, it was the first step in a carefully crafted trap. The Saracen cavalry thundered forward, scimitars raised high, a black storm racing toward the northern warriors. Dust billowed beneath their horses' hooves as they charged straight into what they thought was a weak and fractured defense. And then the trap snapped shut. The circular formations, known as the Wheel of Death, allowed the cavalry to pass between them, but once inside, the Vikings closed ranks, cutting off escape. Riders found themselves funneled into narrow killing zones, where they were struck from all sides at once. Horses screamed. Men fell. In moments, the momentum of the charge collapsed into chaos. The first wave of cavalry was annihilated. The Saracens had expected fear and panic. Instead, they met cold, calculated precision. Every swing of a Viking axe was supported by another. Every shield that blocked a blow opened the path for a counterattack. It was as if the Norsemen shared a single mind, their movements synchronized, their strikes relentless. And perhaps, in a way, they did. Each man believed he was the hand of God, guided by divine will, and together they moved as one unstoppable force. But what terrified the Saracens most was not the skill of their enemy. It was their complete disregard for fear and pain. Men who should have fallen kept fighting. Warriors with arrows lodged in their chests roared and swung their axes with renewed fury. Severely wounded fighters hurled themselves into enemy ranks, killing 2 or 3 foes before collapsing. These were not men fighting for their lives. They were men fighting for paradise. Abu Nasr was shaken but not yet alarmed. Losing 1,000 cavalrymen in the first clash was acceptable. He ordered the second phase of his plan, the mounted archers. They would stay at range and rain death from above, softening the enemy before the next assault. As arrows darkened the sky, the Vikings did something no one expected. They crouched behind makeshift fortifications, crude walls built overnight from scavenged materials and the shields of fallen enemies. They had anticipated this attack too. The arrow storm hissed down like black rain, but most of it clattered harmlessly against their improvised defenses. And then, silence. The archers hesitated. And in that hesitation, the Vikings struck. They hurled their own missiles, not arrows, but spears tipped with jagged hooks designed to drag riders from their saddles. They wielded massive war axes built to rip through armor like parchment. But the most devastating weapon of all was one the Saracens had never seen before, an incendiary substance acquired during the Viking stay in Constantinople, a cousin to the Byzantine Greek fire. When it struck, it ignited instantly, clinging to armor and flesh alike. Water only fed its fury. Panic spread through the Saracen ranks as flames erupted among their cavalry. Horses bolted, riders screamed, and discipline dissolved. The second attack collapsed into chaos, leaving the Vikings bloodied but still standing. Abu Nasr's confidence began to falter. Twice now, his massive army had failed to break a force that should have been crushed in minutes. And worse, his men were afraid. He saw it in their eyes and the hesitation of their movements. Fear was a contagion, and it was spreading fast. Desperation drove his next move. If arrows and cavalry could not defeat the invaders, then sheer numbers would. He ordered his infantry, more than 20,000 men, to advance and envelop the enemy entirely. Against 25 men for every Viking, even the fiercest warriors would crumble. The ground shook as the human tide surged forward, an unstoppable wave of shields and spears. But Magnus had been saving his deadliest weapon for this moment. At 50 meters, when the Saracen infantry was too close to retreat and too committed to stop, Magnus gave the order. Hundreds of incendiary projectiles arced through the air and exploded among the advancing soldiers. The desert erupted into rings of fire. This was no ordinary flame, it clung to cloth and steel, feeding hungrily on the dry desert wind. It burned hotter with every gust, turning the battlefield into a living inferno. Men screamed as their armor melted against their skin. Formations disintegrated as soldiers fled the flames, trampling one another in blind panic. The heat was so intense that even the Vikings could feel it searing their faces, but they did not stop. They roared ancient prayers and surged forward through the fire, cutting down terrified enemies as they ran. The Saracen army, once so disciplined, so confident, began to break. But Abu Nasr was not ready to surrender. In a final desperate gamble, he called upon his elite guard, 2,000 of the finest warriors in the region, men who had never known defeat. Their mission was simple: kill Magnus barefoot and end the Vikings' will to fight. The clash that followed was unlike anything the battlefield had seen. Magnus' personal guard, his most hardened veterans, met Abu Nasr's elite in brutal, close-quarters combat. Shield splintered. Steel shattered. Blood soaked the sand. It was a battle within the battle, a storm of violence in the heart of the inferno. And at the center of it all, two men faced each other, Magnus and Abu Nasr. Abu Nasr was no ordinary commander. He had trained in Damascus's finest schools of swordsmanship. He had fought in dozens of duels and commanded countless battles. But Magnus was something else entirely. Towering over 2 meters tall, wielding a double-headed axe said to have been blessed by the Pope himself, he fought not just with strength but with conviction, the unshakable belief that God guided every swing of his weapon. The duel was brutal and short. Abu Nasr fought with skill, but Magnus fought with destiny. And destiny won. With a final, devastating blow, Magnus' axe cleaved through the commander's defenses and struck him down. The fall of Abu Nasr broke more than his body. It shattered the spirit of his army. Soldiers who had begun the day with unshakable confidence now stared in disbelief. Could these 800 northern fanatics truly be unstoppable? The thought spread like wildfire, and with it came terror. And that terror turned into chaos. What happened next defied every principle of medieval warfare. Instead of retreating in good order or surrendering, the Saracen army disintegrated. 40,000 men became a panicked mob, trampling their own ranks as they fled across the desert. Officers who tried to rally their troops were ignored or cut down by their own soldiers in their desperation to escape. Magnus watched the rout unfold before him. And then he gave a chilling order, one that would stain his legacy for centuries to come. No survivors. This was no longer a battle. It was an extermination. For 3 days, the Vikings hunted the fleeing soldiers across the desert. They cut off escape routes, set ambushes, and cornered terrified fugitives. Every captured enemy was executed, prayers whispered over their corpses as offerings to God. This was not vengeance. It was ritual. It was holy work. On the first day, 10,000 men died. On the second, 15,000 more. By the third, only scattered survivors remained. When it was over, the massacre was complete. Of the original 40,000 Saracen troops, more than 35,000 were dead. The Vikings had lost only 230 of their own. And the world had changed forever. By the time the blood-soaked sand cooled beneath the desert sun, word of the impossible victory was already spreading. Across the Muslim world, shock and fear rippled through palaces and mosques. In Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo, leaders who had once scoffed at the idea of a Christian reconquest now trembled at the thought. If 800 men could annihilate one of the region's greatest armies, what could tens of thousands do? The legend of Magnus Barefoot and his warriors had been born. And as it grew, it would ignite something far greater than a single battle. It would fuel a movement that would change the course of history. When the fires finally died and the cries of the dying faded into the desert wind, silence fell over the battlefield of Herodian. What had begun as a hopeless stand, 800 against 40,000, had ended as one of the most one-sided massacres in medieval history. The ground itself was scorched and soaked in blood. Over 35,000 Saracen soldiers lay dead. The once mighty army that had promised to crush the invaders had been annihilated. And the Vikings, impossibly, were still standing. Of the 800 warriors who had marched into the desert, roughly 230 would never return home, a staggering loss for any army, yet insignificant compared to the obliteration of their enemies. Against all logic, against every principle of medieval warfare, the impossible had happened. And in that moment, history itself shifted. Word of the slaughter spread like wildfire across the Muslim world. Messengers galloped from city to city, carrying news that defied belief. A mere handful of northern barbarians had destroyed an army 40 times their size. At first, the reports were dismissed as exaggeration, propaganda designed to boost Christian morale. But as survivors trickled into Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo, the horrifying truth became undeniable. Panic spread among rulers and generals. For decades, Muslim armies had believed themselves invincible against Christian incursions. They were wealthier, better equipped, and vastly superior in numbers. The Christian kingdoms of Europe were fragmented, disorganized, and plagued by internal conflicts. Yet now, the myth of Muslim superiority had been shattered, not by an empire, but by a band of zealots who fought as if death itself were their ally. Magnus Barefoot understood the power of this moment better than anyone. He knew that battles are not won by swords alone, they are won in the minds of men. And so, even as his warriors buried their dead and tended their wounds, Magnus moved to exploit the psychological earthquake they had unleashed. Shield the weapon of fear. The first step was political. Across the Holy Land, Christian communities who had long suffered under Muslim rule suddenly saw a glimmer of hope. For generations they had endured heavy taxes, restrictions, and forced conversions. But now, with news of the Viking victory, they began to rise. One by one, local militias and rebel groups swore allegiance to Magnus, swelling his numbers from 800 to over 3,000 within weeks. But Magnus did not wage a traditional campaign of conquest. He understood that his greatest weapon was no longer the axe or the sword, it was reputation. Stories of the massacre were deliberately exaggerated and spread by word of mouth. Chroniclers whispered of supernatural forces fighting alongside the Vikings, of arrows that bounced harmlessly off their consecrated armor, of warriors who rose from the dead to continue fighting. Some even claimed that angels themselves had descended from heaven to strike down the Saracens. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was the fear. Entire cities surrendered without a single blow being struck. Fortresses that had withstood years of siege opened their gates at the mere rumor that Magnus' men were approaching. Veteran commanders, men who had spent their lives fighting Crusaders and Byzantines, refused to face the Norse warriors in battle. Fear had become a weapon, and it was more devastating than any blade. Crossed swords, the birth of a new kind of war. The massacre at Herodion did more than terrify the Muslim world. It changed the way wars were fought. The Vikings had demonstrated something revolutionary, that a small, highly disciplined, fanatically motivated force could defeat an enemy many times its size, not by brute strength, but by psychological domination. This concept, that morale and belief could outweigh numbers, spread rapidly throughout Christendom. Kings and generals studied Magnus' tactics. They took note of how he had fused spiritual conviction with military precision, how he had weaponized fear, how he had used fire and terror not merely to kill, but to break the enemy's will. Future Crusader armies would adopt many of the techniques pioneered by Magnus and his men. Elite knightly orders such as the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights drew direct inspiration from the Viking model. They trained not only in the art of war but in the discipline of faith. Their soldiers were expected to fight not for riches or survival, but for salvation, to see death not as an end, but as a passage to glory. The idea of total annihilation, of giving no quarter, of pursuing fleeing enemies, of executing prisoners in the name of God, also became a grim new reality of holy war. What Magnus had done on the sands of Herodion set a precedent. It gave future Crusaders a justification for atrocities that, until then, would have been considered unthinkable. And in doing so, it changed the moral fabric of war itself. Scroll the legend that fueled the crusade. Back in Europe, news of the Viking victory arrived at the perfect time. In 1095, just 3 decades later, Pope Urban II would call for the First Crusade, urging Christian knights to take up the cross and reclaim Jerusalem. And among the stories he and his preachers told to inspire the faithful, none was repeated more often or more dramatically than the story of Magnus Barefoot and his 800 warriors. Chroniclers wrote of miracles on the battlefield. They claimed that angels had guided Viking blades, that demons had fled before their war cries. They spoke of fire that fell from heaven and enemies who turned to dust before the righteous. Over time, the real events of the battle were transformed into legend, and legend became myth. But myths have power. Thousands of knights, barons, and peasants alike, upon hearing the tale, were convinced that God himself favored Christian arms. If 800 men could annihilate 40,000, then surely a united Christendom could drive the Muslims from the Holy Land entirely. The massacre at Herodion didn't just inspire the First Crusade, it became one of its rallying cries. Coffin the death of a king, the birth of a symbol. Magnus Barefoot did not live to see the First Crusade. In 1069, 5 years after the massacre, he was killed in battle near Antioch while fighting Turkish forces. But death only magnified his legend. Songs were sung of his bravery. Churches were built in his honor. His name became a rallying cry for warriors seeking courage in the face of impossible odds. The few Vikings who survived and returned home were treated as heroes. Their stories lit a fire in the hearts of a new generation. Many of those young men would later march east to join the crusading armies, carrying with them the same spirit that had driven Magnus' fanatics, the belief that faith could make the impossible possible. The model he created, small, elite, fanatically dedicated units defeating vastly larger armies, would be replicated again and again in the centuries to come. Sometimes it succeeded spectacularly. Sometimes it ended in disaster. But the lesson remained: conviction could be deadlier than any weapon. Brain, the psychology of the impossible. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the massacre was not military at all, but psychological. Magnus and his warriors proved a principle that commanders and philosophers alike would study for centuries: numbers alone do not decide battles. Morale. Belief. Psychological dominance, these factors could shatter armies larger and better equipped. The Vikings didn't win because they were stronger. They won because they believed they were chosen. Because they were united by a cause greater than themselves. because they understood that the mind, not the sword, is the ultimate battlefield. Even propaganda became a weapon in their hands. Once the Vikings had earned their reputation for invincibility, that reputation did half their work for them. Enemies surrendered without fighting. Allies joined eagerly. Campaigns were won not with steel, but with stories. It was a lesson that would echo far beyond the Crusades. Centuries later, generals from Napoleon to T.E. Lawrence, from Patton to Rommel, would draw on the same principle that the human will, once fully harnessed, can overcome even the most insurmountable odds. Balance scale: a dual legacy, inspiration and warning. From today's perspective, the massacre of Herodian is both awe-inspiring and horrifying. On one hand, it stands as a testament to the extremes of human potential, a reminder of what small groups of dedicated people can achieve when united by belief. On the other, it is a chilling example of how that same belief can be twisted into unimaginable cruelty. The Vikings fought with courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. But they also waged war with brutality, mercilessness, and a total disregard for human life. They slaughtered tens of thousands, not out of hatred, but out of conviction, convinced that God Himself had commanded it. This duality, this ability of faith to both uplift and destroy, is perhaps the most important lesson of all. It forces us to confront a difficult truth: belief itself is neither good nor evil. It is a tool. And like any tool, its morality depends on the hand that wields it. Magnus and his warriors believed they were instruments of divine will. Their enemies saw them as demons unleashed upon the earth. In the end, both views contain a measure of truth. Globe showing Europe-Africa the shadow that never faded. For generations after the massacre, the memory of those northern fanatics haunted the Muslim world. Even as new armies rose and new battles were fought, the legend of the Vikings lingered like a shadow. Commanders planned their campaigns with the fear that Christians might once again unleash such terrifying zeal. Cities strengthened their walls. Armies trained harder. Diplomats negotiated more cautiously. In Europe, the story became one of triumph. It fueled the momentum of the Crusades. It inspired warriors. It terrified opponents. It reshaped the very rules of holy war. And it reminded all of Christendom that faith could move more than mountains, it could move armies. It could alter the course of history. Even 1,000 years later, the lesson still resonates. The massacre of Herodian is taught in military academies not for its tactics, though they were brilliant, but for its psychology. It is studied not just as a battle, but as a demonstration of the raw power of conviction. And above all, it remains a story, a warning and an inspiration about the heights and depths of which humanity is capable when united by a cause greater than itself. The legacy of Magnus Barefoot and his 800 warriors is not simply a tale of victory. It is a mirror, reflecting both the light and darkness within the human spirit. It shows us how courage can become fanaticism, how faith can fuel both heroism and atrocity, and how the impossible often exists only in the mind. Their story challenges us to ask, what do we believe in so fiercely that we would risk everything for it? And, perhaps more importantly, what would we become if we ever did? Because in the end, the massacre of Herodian was not just about 800 men defeating 40,000. It was about the terrifying power of belief, a power that, once unleashed, can change the fate of nations and the course of history itself. The smoke had cleared. The bodies had cooled. The sands of Herodian, once golden and untouched, were now dark and heavy with ash, blood, and memory. The cries of the dying had long faded into silence, and the winds that swept across the battlefield carried with them more than the stench of war, they carried the echo of a legend. It was over. 800 Viking warriors had done the impossible. They had defied every principle of military logic, shattered an army that should have overwhelmed them, and written their names into the fabric of history with blood and fire. But their story did not end when the last Saracen fell. In many ways, it was only beginning. What remained was not just a field of the dead, it was a question. One that would haunt empires, inspire crusades, and challenge the way humanity understood war, faith, and the human will itself. Balance scale: a mirror to human nature. The massacre at Herodion is often remembered as a story of courage and faith, and indeed, it is that. It is a testament to the sheer force of human determination, to the power of belief to push men beyond their physical and psychological limits. These 800 Vikings were not stronger, faster, or more numerous than their enemies. What they had was conviction, the unshakable certainty that they were chosen, that their deaths would mean salvation, that their victory was preordained. But to call this story heroic is only half the truth. It is also a story of unspeakable brutality, a story of men who, convinced of their own righteousness, slaughtered without mercy, executed prisoners in cold blood, and turned the battlefield into a theater of ritual extermination. Their belief did not just fuel courage. It justified atrocity. That is the duality of human nature laid bare. The same conviction that allows us to achieve the extraordinary also enables us to commit the unthinkable. It is a lesson as old as history and as relevant now as it was in 1064. Compass the power and peril of belief. Why did these 800 men succeed where others would have failed? Not because they were invincible, but because they believed they were. Not because they were unbreakable, but because they refused to break. Their faith transformed them into something far more dangerous than a mere army. It turned them into an idea, and ideas, as history has shown time and time again, are harder to kill than men. That idea, that absolute belief can overcome impossible odds, became the cornerstone of countless military strategies in the centuries to follow. From the Crusader knights who charged into battle under the sign of the cross to the revolutionary armies of later centuries who fought for liberty and nationhood, the principle remained the same. Belief could move mountains. It could topple empires. It could bend history. But there is a darker side to that truth. For if belief can lead people to acts of unimaginable courage, it can also lead them to acts of unimaginable cruelty. The same certainty that carried the Vikings through impossible odds also convinced them that their enemies were less than human, that slaughter was sanctified, that annihilation was holy. It is a paradox that has echoed through history, from religious wars and crusades to revolutions and genocides. Belief can unite. It can also destroy. Globe showing Europe-Africa ripples through time. The massacre at Herodion was more than a battle. It was a turning point, a moment that reshaped the world around it in ways no one on that field could have foreseen. In the Muslim world, the defeat left deep scars. Generations of commanders would plan their campaigns with the memory of the Vikings in mind, always wary of the terrifying zeal that could turn a handful of warriors into a force of nature. Fortresses grew taller. Armies grew larger. Caution replaced arrogance. The legend of the northern demons lingered like a ghost on every battlefield that followed. In Europe, the story became legend, a rallying cry for those who would march east in the name of God. It fueled the First Crusade, inspired new orders of warrior monks, and justified a new and more brutal style of holy war. The methods Magnus and his warriors pioneered, the use of terror as a weapon, the total destruction of the enemy, the fusion of faith and violence, would be repeated again and again over the next 2 centuries. And beyond the Crusades, the lessons of Herodion continued to echo. They were studied by generals, kings, and philosophers. They were invoked by revolutionaries and tyrants alike. They were cited as proof of the power of human will, and as a warning of what happens when that will is given free rein. Brain lessons for the modern age. 1,000 years have passed since the day 800 men changed the course of history. The weapons have evolved. The battlefields have shifted. But the lesson remains as relevant today as it was then. We like to believe that wars are decided by technology, by logistics, by numbers. But again and again, history proves otherwise. Battles are won and lost in the hearts and minds of those who fight them. The greatest weapon is not the sword or the gun or the bomb. It is belief. Belief gives people the strength to endure unimaginable hardship. It drives them to sacrifice everything for a cause. It unites them against overwhelming odds. But belief, unchecked and unquestioned, is also the most dangerous force in the world. It can blind us to reason. It can justify horrors. It can turn ordinary men into monsters. The massacre at Herodion is both a warning and a reminder. It warns us of the darkness that can emerge when conviction is allowed to override compassion. And it reminds us of the extraordinary things humanity is capable of when united by a purpose greater than itself. Fire, a legacy written in blood and fire. Even now, centuries later, the story of Magnus Barefoot and his 800 warriors captivates us, not just because of what they achieved, but because of what their story says about us. It speaks to our capacity for courage and cruelty, for sacrifice and savagery. It shows us the best and worst of what we can become. It also forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Would we have fought as they did? Could we have stood against such impossible odds? And if we believed, as they did, that God was on our side, what would we be capable of? These are not questions with easy answers. But they are questions worth asking. Because the story of Herodian is not just about the past. It is about the present and the future. The same forces that shaped that battlefield still shape our world today. Faith, fear, ideology, identity. They drive nations to war, inspire people to rise against tyranny, and, at times, lead humanity to the brink of destruction. The tools have changed, but the core remains the same. The thin line between legend and horror. In the end, how we remember the massacre of Herodian depends on where we stand. To the Vikings, it was divine justice, a holy mission fulfilled, a victory ordained by God. To the Saracens, it was a nightmare, an invasion by demons, a slaughter without mercy. To historians, it was a turning point, a moment that redefined the nature of war. And to us, it is all of these things at once. It is a legend and a lesson. A triumph and a tragedy. A story of human greatness and human horror intertwined so tightly that they cannot be separated. Perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of the 800, that history is rarely black and white. It lives in the gray, in the space between courage and cruelty, faith and fanaticism, victory and atrocity. Acts Epilogue, the immortal 800. Magnus Barefoot never lived to see how far his shadow stretched. But his story, and the story of the men who followed him into the desert, outlived them all. It shaped crusades, inspired armies, terrified empires, and taught generations that the limits of possibility are not physical, they are psychological. Even now, a millennium later, their legacy endures. Military academies still study their tactics. Leaders still quote their courage. And storytellers still return to that barren field where 800 men defied the impossible and rewrote the rules of war. It is a story that reminds us of one simple, eternal truth: the greatest battles we fight are not against enemies on the battlefield, but against the limits we place on ourselves. When belief is stronger than fear, when purpose outweighs pain, when conviction overcomes doubt, even the impossible can fall. And so, the tale of the 800 is more than just a chapter in history. It is a mirror, reflecting who we are, what we're capable of, and what we must guard against. It is a warning, a celebration, and a challenge, all at once. A warning about the darkness that can grow from absolute belief. A celebration of the power of the human spirit. And a challenge, to remember that the line between legend and horror is thinner than we think. For in the end, the most terrifying weapon on any battlefield is not the sword or the fire. It is the human will. And when that will is united, when it is sharpened by faith, hardened by purpose, and unleashed without restraint, it can change the course of history forever. The wind still whispers across the plains of Herodian. Centuries have passed since blood soaked this desert, yet if you stand there today, beneath the same relentless sun, on the same unforgiving ground, you can almost hear echoes of that day. The clash of steel. The roar of berserkers. The thunder of hooves. And the prayers whispered by dying men, certain that heaven awaited them beyond the battlefield. The massacre of Herodian was more than just a battle. It was a moment when the impossible became real, when faith defeated numbers, when willpower overcame logic, when 800 men changed the course of history. But to truly understand its legacy, we must look not only at what happened in 1064, but at what has happened ever since. The myth that became memory. Every great civilization needs its myths, stories that explain who they are, what they value, and what they're capable of. For the Norse, Herodian became one such story. It was told in mead halls and monasteries, sung by skalds and chronicled by priests. Children grew up hearing of Magnus Barefoot and his chosen 800 warriors who fought like gods and died like saints. But this myth was not confined to Scandinavia. It traveled. It spread through Europe with the speed of a wildfire, morphing with every telling. Chroniclers in France claimed angels fought beside the Vikings. In Italy, they said a divine wind blinded the Saracens. In England, bards sang that the ground itself rose up to shield the Norsemen. Each retelling exaggerated the miracle, and with every exaggeration, the story grew more powerful. By the time Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, Herodian had become more than history. It was proof. Proof that God favored Christian arms. Proof that victory was guaranteed. Proof that no matter the odds, the faithful could not be defeated. And so, armies marched east not only with swords and shields, but with a story, the story of the 800. Crossed swords shadows of their tactics. Long after the blood dried on the sands of Herodian, the tactics pioneered by Magnus and his warriors continued to evolve. The idea of small, elite, faith-driven units became the foundation for new military orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights. These were not armies in the traditional sense, they were brotherhoods bound by oaths of faith and discipline, modeled on the ferocity and unity of the Norsemen. Their methods, terror, psychological warfare, relentless pursuit, no mercy, became standard practice in the Crusades. Entire cities were emptied not because they were conquered, but because they surrendered before the fight began. Fear, once unleashed on the battlefield of Herodian, became a strategic weapon in wars across continents. Even centuries later, the echoes remained. From Genghis Khan's Mongol hordes to Napoleon's Imperial Guard, from the guerrilla fighters of revolutions to the elite special forces of the modern era, the principle remained the same: small, disciplined, fanatically motivated forces could achieve what numbers alone could not. The Vikings had not just won a battle. They had rewritten the rulebook of war. Globe showing Europe-Africa the echo in modern times. It is easy to dismiss stories like Herodian as relics of a brutal and superstitious past. But look closer, and you will see its fingerprints on our world today. In the 20th century, resistance fighters and insurgents learned that a handful of determined men could hold back empires. In the 21st, special operations units, from Navy SEALs to SAS, still embody the same philosophy: train harder, strike smarter, believe deeper. Even modern statecraft draws on lessons first written in blood by Magnus men. Psychological warfare, propaganda, the cultivation of myth, all tools first sharpened on that battlefield. The tools of war have changed. But the psychology of power and the power of psychology remains the same. Compass the thin line between hero and monster. Yet for all the admiration the Vikings inspire, their story forces us to confront a deeper question: were they heroes or monsters? To their own people, they were saints, warriors chosen by God to fight evil. To the Saracens, they were demons, butchers who slaughtered men as they fled and executed prisoners in the name of righteousness. Both versions are true. Neither tells the whole story. This duality, that the same act can be both heroic and horrific, is what makes Herodian such a haunting chapter in human history. It is a reminder that morality in war is rarely black and white. It is a spectrum painted in shades of red, of blood, of fire, of sacrifice, and of sin. Magnus Barefoot believed he was doing God's work. His enemies believed they were defending their faith. In their eyes, both were right. And perhaps, in their own ways, both were. Ask the man behind the legend. Magnus himself did not live to see the world he had helped shape. He fell in 1069, fighting Turkish forces near Antioch. Yet his death only deepened the legend. He was no longer merely a king, he became a symbol. His axe, said to be blessed by the Pope, was enshrined as a relic. Songs of his deeds were sung across Europe. Knights prayed in his name before charging into battle. Entire generations of warriors grew up wanting to be like Magnus, fearless, unstoppable, chosen. But there was another side to the man. Chronicles written decades later describe a leader plagued by doubt in his final days, a man who wondered whether his crusade had truly served God or merely satisfied his own ambition. We will never know the truth. But perhaps that question, unanswerable, uncomfortable, is the most honest legacy he left behind. Sunrise: The Lessons of Herodian. So what do we, centuries removed from the blood and dust, take from this story? First, we learn that belief is the most powerful force on earth. It can lift ordinary men to greatness. It can turn farmers into warriors and warriors into legends. It can make the impossible possible. Second, we learn that belief, unchecked, is also the most dangerous force on earth. It can justify cruelty. It can sanctify slaughter. It can transform human beings into instruments of destruction. Third, we learn that history is shaped not by numbers, but by will. Empires rise and fall not because of their armies, but because of the conviction, or the collapse, of those who fight for them. And finally, we learn that the stories we tell matter. Myths like Herodian endure because they speak to something fundamental in us, our hunger to believe that we are capable of more than we think, that we can overcome impossible odds, that our actions can echo through eternity. A final reflection. As the sun sets over the desert, the battlefield lies silent once more. Time has erased the blood, buried the bones, and scattered the banners. Yet the story remains, not carved in stone, but etched into the collective memory of humanity. It is the story of 800 men who refused to bow to fate. Of a king who believed he was chosen by God. Of a massacre that was both miracle and monstrosity. It is a story that challenges us to look within ourselves and ask hard questions. What do we believe in so fiercely that we would fight for it? Where is the line between faith and fanaticism, between courage and cruelty? And what legacy will we leave behind? Because the truth is this: history is not shaped by the vast and the many. It is shaped by the few, by those who dare to believe when all reason says they should not. By those who refuse to surrender when the world tells them to. By those who, like the Vikings of Herodian, step into the impossible and make it real. And so, their story endures, not just as a chapter in a book, but as a mirror held up to us all. For in the end, the lesson of the 800 is not about war or conquest. It is about the boundless potential and the terrifying power of the human spirit. In the end, history is not just a record of kings and empires, of battles fought and borders drawn. It is a mirror, reflecting who we are, what we fear, and what we believe we are capable of. And in that mirror, the story of the 800 Vikings at Herodian stares back at us across 1,000 years. It reminds us that courage is not about numbers, nor strength, nor even victory. It is about defiance, the refusal to accept the impossible, even when the world insists you should. It shows us that faith, in its purest form, can lift ordinary people to extraordinary heights, but also that the same faith, unchecked, can plunge humanity into unimaginable darkness. Those men who fought beneath the scorching desert sun believed they were chosen by God. Their enemies saw them as monsters. And perhaps they were both. Heroes and butchers. Saints and demons. Victors and villains, all at once. But their story endures because it is more than history. It is a question: what do we believe in so fiercely that we would risk everything for it? And what would we become if we did? The 800 are long gone. Their bones have turned to dust. But their lesson remains, that belief can shape the world more powerfully than any weapon, and that the only true limit to human potential is the one we place upon ourselves. So now, the question is yours to answer. If 800 men could defy the impossible 1,000 years ago, what might you achieve if you believed with the same fire in your heart? Tell us in the comments below, would you fight for what you believe in, even if the whole world stood against you? Thought Balloon. We read every story, and the best ones might appear in our next episode. If this journey through blood, faith, and history moved you, don't let it end here. Crossed Swords, subscribe to the channel and join our growing community of history lovers and truth seekers. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that the limits of possibility are often illusions. Scroll and ring the bell so you never miss the next forgotten story that shaped our world. Because history isn't just something that happened. It's something that lives in us, through us, and because of us.